I will start this lecture by asking, what is the sense of beauty? What are aesthetic judgments and how do we make them? I present an approach that is inspired by Kant. Then I ask, how do biologists, especially evolutionary biologists, approach the question of animals' aesthetic judgment? And I draw here mainly on Darwin and on Prüm, Richard Prüm, who studied the evolution of beauty in animals. Then I want to discuss very briefly the grounding of the aesthetic sense, the sensory and cognitive biases and possibilities they open up, the desires and the cultural affordances that together shape our human aesthetic judgments. I then would like to say something about the explanatory power of the beautiful in scientific explanation. And here I draw on the work of an ex-student of mine, Shani Bar. And I will end with our personal journey, using visual art to explore the science of consciousness. The screen again has appeared. I haven't done anything.
I
Sandra?
saw. I have an idea.
So what do we do? Shall I do it? Shall I do it with the PDF? Maybe it won't do it.
No. I have an idea. I can fix it. So don't worry about that. By now, don't worry about that, and go straight.
Okay. So you will edit this, yes? Of course.
Yes. I'll do that. I'll do that.
Okay. So I start with Kant. Kant published the critique, or the third critique, which includes the critique of aesthetic judgment, in 1790. And he suggested that when we encounter patterns that display an order which does not fit a pre-existing framework, that cannot be subsumed under a pre-existing concept, our recognition of this unexplained order and the free play of imagination that it induces give us pleasure, excite us, and inspire us. And this is the basis of our critique our critique of our judgment of aesthetic of beauty. The pleasure of recognizing, exploring, and searching for the meaning of such patterns is grounded, he suggested, in the shared sensibilities of the community. This shared sensibilities include sensory affordances, the way that our sensory organs are built, the cognitive affordances, the way that our brains work, our cognitive capacities, in the human case, the free play of imagination, and the affordances of the cultural zeitgeist, the spirit of the time. These shared sensibilities render our judgment of taste communicable. It's not just, I like it, but I don't know if you like it or not. Everything is relative to me and subjective. No, this is something communicable. And this gives our experience of the beautiful a normative value. Everyone should enjoy it. Everyone should appreciate it. Now, Kant was very much interested and focused on human aesthetic judgment, and specifically on the cognitive side of it. He thought of aesthetic judgment as something that is disinterested, that gives a full range, a full stage to the free play of imagination. However, biologists, when they thought about it, and they were thinking about animals, so they thought in a slightly different way. Do animals have a taste for the beautiful? Darwin suggested that yes, they do. They said that they have an aesthetic faculty, a taste for the beautiful, that is exercised, for example, and mainly during the choosing of a mate. This is the basis of the evolution of ornamental traits in animals, he suggested. Such ornaments, he said, are evolutionary products of cumulative selection driven by evaluation based on the taste for the beautiful. So what you see here is a gray female fish who is scrutinizing a very beautiful male who is displaying for her. And what Darwin suggested was that the beautiful pattern that we see on the male are the product of cumulative process of choices during evolution, choices by females who like this type of variability, who like this type of patterns. So the object of choice, he suggested, and others suggested, may have been initially indicators of biological quality. For example, bright colors can indicate the vigor of the male, and its health, but they may also have been chosen because of the whims of the chooser, because this is how she felt about it at that time. However, since there is coupling between the exhibited property that is displayed and the preference for it, they co-evolve. With mate choice, exaggerated male ornaments and the preference of the female for extravagance will both be transmitted to their offspring. And that may lead to a kind of positive feedback, to extravagant attractive traits that have no utility beyond their attractiveness. This views the idea that there is no utility beyond their attractiveness resonates with the intuition that Kant also had, that art and beauty go beyond direct utility. The exploration of patterns is driven, according to the biologist, by desire and by the joy of seeking. And here is what Darwin said, his own words. He who admits the principle of sexual selection will be led to the remarkable conclusion that the cerebral system not only regulates most of the existing functions of the body, but has indirectly influenced the progressive development of various bodily structures and of certain mental qualities. Courage, pugnacity, perseverance, strength, and size of body, weapons of all kinds, musical organs, both vocal and instrumental, bright colors, stripes and marks, and ornamental appendages have all been indirectly gained by the one sex or the other through the influence of love and jealousy, through the appreciation of the beautiful in sound, color, or from and through the exertion of choice. And these powers of the mind manifestly depend on the development of the cerebral system. And what we see on the right, one of Anna's pictures, all the pictures here are hers, we see the male white-spotted pufferfish, who constructs on the seabed a 2-meter wide sand circle with very complex symmetrical internal pattern. It decorates this structure with shell fragments and brings fine sand particles into the innermost central area of the circle, into which the female will lay eggs if she deems the mandala-like structure that we see here good enough. Now, we agree with Darwin that in order to make this type of selection, to select and choose this kind of ornaments, this kind of patterns, consciousness is needed. Subjective experiencing is needed. And we argued at great length that animals that can discriminate among different complex images and patterns of action and that can make choices among them are subjectively experiencing animals. Such animals have subjective experience both of the pattern that they perceive, as well as the subjective experience of their evaluation of these patterns. For example, pleasure. They actually feel pleasure. The choices they make on the basis of their experiences can lead to the evolution of intricate, ever more enjoyable and desirable patterns. There are many examples for that, but the complex patterns on the body of the male fish that we saw earlier would evolve only if females could discriminate among variant patterns and prefer some to others. They can make very fine discriminations and give them value. The evolution of the visual and olfactory patterns of flowers depended on the ability of insects and birds to discriminate among visual and olfactory patterns. It is no coincidence that unlike animal-pollinated flowers, wind-pollinated flowers have no complex visual patterns and smells. The wind that pollinates them has no consciousness. But insects and birds do have subjective experiences. So at the top here on the right, we see insect-pollinated flower, and on the bottom we see a wind-pollinated flower, which is white and very simple in structure. Richard Prum is an ornithologist who studies the extraordinary sexual displays of birds, and he wrote a book about the evolution of beauty in the animal world. He suggests that we should consider the complex patterns in the animal world as a form of art. And he says, art consists of a form of communication that co-evolves with its own evaluation. For example, again, the form of the flower and the sensory systems and judgments of the pollinators have co-evolved with each other. The song of the May nightingale co-evolved with the aesthetic judgments of the female, the musical aesthetic judgments of the female. Biological art, like human art, is a community, population phenomenon. It is something that happens over time in a population of evaluators and exhibitors, producers. What we consider as art is very context and history dependent. Think, for example, about Cubism and Futurism in 20th century art, visual art, which would not have been considered art in the 18th century. So it's very, very dependent on the context, the intellectual, cultural context in which one lives, social context, of course. Prum says, art and aesthetics are emergent consequences of advertisement communication, evaluation, choice, and evolutionary, and I would add, or historical feedback. They cannot be reduced to more fundamental processes. However, it is very clear for every biologist who thinks a little bit about it, that not all biotic advertisements are beautiful. You can advertise also something that is disgusting because you want other animals to get away from you. For example, to be afraid of you, to avoid attacking you. The beautiful, according to Prum, also requires positive sensory engagement of the evaluator. It requires attraction, pleasure, joy. And he says, because attraction and engagement are the most efficient contexts for the maintenance of coevolutionary process, beauty is the overwhelmingly predominant aesthetic property in both biotic and human aesthetics. Beauty is predominant because positive aesthetic engagement will foster the most persistent, detailed, and profound forms of the coevolutionary interaction that drive all aesthetic process. In other words, beauty is the null or default aesthetic property of art. Now, I will not go into all the various kinds of sensory biases that people recognize as important for the evaluation of beauty in humans and in animals. Among them are symmetry, variability, brightness of color, and so on. I want to look at one particular bias, which is interesting, which was discovered by Heinrich Kluwer, an early 20th century German psychologist. He documented how his visual field changed under the influence of a hallucinogen. He saw recurring patterns, lattices, tunnels, spirals, and cobwebs. These patterns, he argued, were similar to shapes commonly found in ancient cave drawings. They're also similar to the mandalas that symbolize the self in many cultures. And we see an example of it on the right-hand side. It is argued that these patterns stem from the way that the visual part of the brain is organized in humans and other animals. This is not the work of Kluwer, but the work that followed Kluwer. The connections among neurons in the visual area, the connections in the brain, give rise to these patterns only when the activity of the brain is spontaneous and no longer dominated by signals that come from the world. It happens during mystical experiences, under the influence of hallucinogens, and in other extreme circumstances, also in dreams. It is a very strong shared cognitive bias that anchors some of our aesthetic appreciations. Now, when we think about animals, we tend to think about these sensory biases and cognitive biases. We don't think about cultural biases because not many of us recognize the fact that animals actually have their own cultures. So here is an example of bowerbirds. Bowerbirds are birds that are found, among other places, in New Guinea. And the male bowerbird, the blue bird on the right, constructs a bower for the females to the female, and it decorates both the bower and the surrounding of the bower. And the female comes and scrutinizes it and looks if it's up to her standards. Now, what is very interesting here is that different populations of the same species have different styles of bowers. So some of the bowers are more kind of gray, black, brown colors, very elegant and tall. Others have a lot more flowers decorating them and different colors of flowers and so on. And the female will find the bower of her own community attractive. She will not be very impressed by a bower of a different of a different population. So different populations have different bower styles, and the females, the males create different forms of art, and the females have preferences for these particular forms of art of their own community. When we think about humans, of course, everything in humans is multidimensional and complicated, very much more complicated than in other animals. It's an entangled web of sensory, cultural, economic, and religious affordances. And here is an example that is shown in this figure. The domestication of the pepper 6,000 years ago by the Mexican people. The Mexican people selected for size, for taste, for smell, for visual variety, and for beauty. The outcome reflected and reinforced the agricultural, social, artistic, and religious symbolic values and practices of the people. Their aesthetic judgments reflect this entangled web of interactions. That is true for many, many different things. But what about science? What is the role of beauty in the process of scientific development? Scientists often talk about the beauty of a discovery or the beauty of a theory. Is it just a figure of speech? I don't think it's just a figure of speech. I think that aesthetic judgment plays a very important role in science. And I draw on the research of my ex-student, Shanine Barr, who studied this subject. It is said in the Babylonian Talmud, in the name of the Amora Rabbi Hanina, I learned much from my teachers and from my colleagues, more than from my teachers, and from my students, most of all. And this is certainly true in this case. What Shani was trying to understand is how one can explain the appreciation of a scientific novelty, of a breakthrough that cannot be subsumed under a current scientific paradigm. How is a paradigm shift possible? She applied Kant's ideas on aesthetic judgment in art to explain how scientific novelty can initiate a shift to a new theoretical framework. She argued that before a new theory that can explain the new discoveries is developed, aesthetic judgment is applied to the new discovery. The scientist becomes aware of the apparent and as yet unexplained order displayed by the discovery, its purposiveness without purpose, by means of his or her pleasure in this unexplained order, recognized order. It sees the order, but it doesn't understand it. The discovery of these patterns induces exploration based on humans' reflective capacities and their desire for meaning through the free play of imagination, which is itself pleasurable. The desire for meaning and the joy of seeking lead eventually to a new concept, a new framework. The unexplained purposiveness of the new discovery is recognizable by the scientist and his community because of their shared communal sense, their shared reflective tools, shared curiosity, shared intellectual, culturally constructed zeitgeist in which the free play of imagination occurs. And one of the important things about human is our desire to make sense through the free play of imagination. And Kurt Vonnegut put it very, very well. Tiger got to hunt, bird got to fly, men got to sit and wonder, why? That's us. Now, what is the zeitgeist? If we're thinking about humans, what is the spirit of the time that anchors both our artistic and scientific views of the world in our century, in the 20th and 21st century? In a very important book, but not much read book, published in 1969, Behind Appearances, a study of the relations between painting and the natural sciences in this century, the biologist Conrad Waddington pointed out some of these outlooks which are shared by both scientists and artists. For example, he pointed out that there is no strict dichotomy between the subjective and objective realities. Although the observer does not wholly fashion what she observes, her intrinsic biological human nature and her individual character color it. He also emphasized the recognition and celebration of variability, of connectedness and embeddedness at different scales. Things have very fuzzy edges and are not wholly determinate. Things are actually events or processes whose stability and change cannot be adequately understood using a single spatial and temporal scale. And in the picture, we see Anna's depiction of vision. Vision is the result of an interaction of sensory biases, how the eye is built, for example, the brain, how the brain is built, the physical properties of the world, the wavelength, the kind of culture in which we live, our own idiosyncratic taste, but also our shared kind of sensibilities. The fact that we can extend through technology, through culture, the range of the things that we see, through telescopes, through microscopes, the fact that our appreciation that different animals see the world in different ways, all this is together form our understanding of what vision is. So we tried to capture and use aesthetic judgment in order to understand our own science, our own scientific research. And in our recent book, Picturing the Mind Through the Lens of Evolution, we tried to show the interpenetration of art and science. Simona and I used Anna's art to explore our own ideas, to open up new possibilities of understanding that go beyond our own inferences, our own framework. Her art made us engage in seeking new concepts and new meanings beyond the comfort zone of our own theory. So we started the book with the exploration of different metaphors of the mind. And one of the metaphors is expressed by a very beautiful poem by a 15th century Japanese poet, Ikkyu Sojon. What is the mind? It is the sound of the breeze that passes through the pines in the Indian ink picture. And what Anat did was to take this poem, and this poem is about a representation, the representation in words of an idea, that the imagined sound of the breeze in the imagined pines in the imagined Indian ink picture. So we have multiple levels of representation, which together capture something of the nature of the mind. What she did, she added another level of representation here by using the words of this poem in Hebrew and in English to draw a calligram of a pine tree in the wind. And in addition to giving this additional level of representation, she also physically, visually presented us with the direct experience of the verbal image depicted in the poem. Here is another example. In one section, we discussed a recurring theme in systems of philosophy and theology, the idea that two principles, either antagonistic or complementary, shape the human mind: good and evil, God and Satan, emotion and reason, female and male, yin and yang, eros and tantalus. And when Anat took this idea, she drew this picture on the right, which goes beyond these dichotomies. Yes, there are distinctions that we can make, but there are many, many aspects to every category. We cannot make such dichotomous categories. There are many categories, and they are entangled. And we ended the book with by discussing Stanislav Lem's book Solaris, which describes the limits of human understanding. It describes an ocean, a gelatinous kind of ocean, which is both living and conscious, that the humans studying it recognize as being alive and conscious, but totally cannot understand. What they can say, for example, is that it is a symphony in geometry, but we lack the ears to hear it. So they recognize the order, and it inspires them. There is also great beauty in it, but that's the limits of their judgment of it. And the pictures shows us Anat's depictions of this complexity, of this aesthetic only judgment. And I want to finish with Rita Levi-Montalcini again. I want to come back to her because I think in this picture we also see the complex web of interactions between this woman's creativity, personality, commitment, and love of art and science. Thank you very much.